Good morning, church. As you're all aware of, this is a time of great uncertainty. Of course, the very format that we're meeting is because of the dangers associated with the coronavirus. There's been situations and shutdowns that have been unprecedented in our lifetime, and it's literally affected the entire globe. And yet, I see God's hand in it all. This last week, every conversation that I've witnessed as I've walked by and heard people speaking, it's been about the coronavirus and the effects of it. Even one of the maintenance men in my building, as I was walking out the back door, I heard him say, "Jesus is coming. We need to repent." And that's something I've never heard somebody just say casually in passing. I do believe that God is waking up our atheistic world with a strong reminder of our mortality. One of the strongest emotions I see as I go about my day is just fear in the hearts of people. I did a lengthy study on fear and love and God's provision and protection, and it landed me at Psalm chapter 23, which I would like to go over for our study today. Let's go ahead and turn there. We'll read it through. In verse 1, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The title of the lesson this morning is "The Lord is my shepherd." I have 3 points. Verses 1 through 3 are "I lack nothing." Verse 4, "I will fear no evil." Verses 5 and 6, "Goodness and love all of my days." You know, as I was studying this out, I looked a little bit into the background of it, and I thought I would share a few things with you. As you know, this was written by King David, and he himself was a shepherd, so this psalm would have had some special meaning to him, as this had been his profession before he became king. Turn, if you would, let's get a little bit of background information. 1 Samuel chapter 17. You recall the account where David faces Goliath, and before he goes out to meet him, as he's conversing with King Saul, he says in verse 34, but David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping your father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." You know, you see, one, that David was a shepherd, but also he cared for the sheep so much that he was willing to risk his life. He was quite brave, and he was certainly a warrior, even from a young age. Look in 2 Samuel chapter 7. In verse 8. "Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from following the flock to be ruler over my people. I've been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on the earth. And so you see that it was God who gave him advancement. God took him from the pasture and made him king. And it says here that he was granted success because it was God who was with him. And not only did God give him success, but God also gave him fame. He made his name great. Go back to 1 Samuel and look in chapter 13. In verse 14. This is Samuel who's speaking to King Saul. He says, "But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him as leader of his people." And so this is where we understand that David was a man after God's own heart. We know that David sinned grossly with Bathsheba. He committed adultery. We understand that he had Bathsheba's husband Uriah killed. He was guilty of murder. And certainly we're aware of his shortcomings in his family. He was sentimental with his children. And yet when we think of King David, we remember him as a man after God's own heart. And so I think it's encouraging for all of us to know that you can have some pretty significant shortcomings. You can have some pretty big mistakes. You can have some gross sin. And yet if you repent and you change and you come back to God, you can still be remembered as a hero or a man or woman after God's own heart. You may want to do a study on Psalm chapter 51, is when he realizes his sin and he draws back close to God. Getting back to Psalm chapter 23, the title of the lesson, "The Lord is my shepherd." We'll pick it up in verse 1, point 1, "I lack nothing." In the NIV 1984, it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want." In the 2011, it says, "I lack nothing." In the NLT, it says, "I have all that I need." You know, it's an interesting conversation. I think we all understand the wording, "I shall not be in want." It essentially implies I have all I need. But those are interesting words, needs versus wants. To say I lack nothing or I shall not be in want implies that you actually have a lot. Typically, if you were to say, I'm lacking nothing, then you have a lot of whatever it is. And yet the NLT says, "I have all I need." Well, it's a very different wording, because how much do you really need? Oftentimes, not much. I have the honor, my wife and I, to travel to South Asia and be involved with many disciples over there. And the people live somewhat simple lives, especially compared to Western society. Many of the people have but a few sets of clothes. Most homes have little furniture. And many of our brothers and sisters literally sleep on a mat on the floor. And what's interesting is they really don't spend much time worrying about what they do or don't have. My son Malik came home for spring break. It was certainly great to have him. And we found out while he was here that his spring break was extended by 2 weeks. Now, it would later on go to be, school would be canceled completely, and he'd have to move out of the dorms because of the coronavirus, and he's going to be living with us for the next 6 months, doing classes virtually. But before we knew that, we just knew he would be here for 3 weeks. And he wanted to go back to school to go get more clothes, because he said he only had a week's worth of clothes. And he said, if I don't get more clothes, I'll have to do laundry every week. And I kind of chuckled a little bit, because that's such American thinking. You know, many places in the world, that's all they have is 1 week's worth of clothes. When we went to Nepal this summer, It was really an incredible experience. I was there for 2 months. My parents were also there for 2 months, and Brandon and the kids were there for approximately 1 month. And I took just a suitcase with me, about a week's worth of clothes. I had one suit. I bought two ties while I was there. I actually forgot to pack my ties. I had one shirt. I had two Bibles. I had one set of dress shoes, one set of running shoes, and a set of casual shoes. And it was incredibly liberating to literally have all I own just in a suitcase. I could pick up and leave whenever I want. I never had to worry about what I was going to wear. It was amazing. I never felt that I needed more. In fact, when I came home, I wanted to say, let me just get rid of everything, because for the last 2 months I had lived with no television and essentially no belongings. Let's get back to Psalm chapter 23. Need versus want. Verse 2. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Let's stop there. I did a bit of a study on this. Excuse me. And when you read about green pastures, in my mind, the green pastures and quiet waters, I'd always pictured a nice green, lush meadow with a brook flowing through it. And I was doing some reading on this, and the commentators said that likely what David's referring to, because there's hills and mountains around Jerusalem, was that this pasture land where the sheep would go actually was not flat and green, but it was actually somewhat sparse with mountain paths that would have some grass on each side. And so when the sheep would walk through, it wasn't like they would just lay down in the grass, but they would walk and they could eat just a little bit as they were going by from this, sparse grass that was on their sides. And so there was an implication that it was God that was guiding them through and taking care of the daily provisions. Now, it was just enough, but not a whole lot of surplus, but enough for the day. I know for us that we always want more. And the thing to realize from this psalm is that God always gives us enough. Right now, with the coronavirus, it's a time of great financial uncertainty. Many are out of work completely, or their hours have been drastically cut. Closures may have caused them to lose their jobs altogether. I was at Key Food the other day, and it was interesting because the shelves for certain products were literally completely stripped bare. All of the pasta was completely purchased. Canned goods, totally gone. And the lines went from the front of the store all the way to the back of the store. Everybody who walked out had, under one arm, toilet paper, on the other arm, paper towels, and all their canned goods. A situation with uncertainty, where we feel like we don't have all that we need, it creates fear. It creates panic. And for us, we have to fundamentally embrace that God will give us what we need. Now, He won't give us what we want, but what we need. In this time of uncertainty, I think many of us will be tempted to hold back in our giving, in our contribution, in our weekly giving, as well as our missions. I think especially many of us with decreased income will be tempted to hold back. Now, as a church, I want you to know that we're going to do our best to cut expenses, both locally and internationally, because we are aware that there will be a financial hit. However, we need to realize that this is a temporary time, and we will all get through it. The worst thing we can do is hold back in fear, because fear is the opposite of faith. At a time of uncertainty is when you need God's provision the most. Don't give in to temptation to be self-reliant and be faithless. Instead, continue to trust in God. Continue to sacrifice and continue to take care of the needs of the kingdom, both locally and abroad. This is a time where we need to make sure that we are understanding God will give us what we need, but not necessarily what we want. It says here, quiet waters. The obvious, contrast to the quiet waters would be, like a raging river. And a shepherd understands that his sheep really are not that intelligent. And if you were to lead them by a raging river, they could easily be swept away. And so you get this imagery of the kind and the caring shepherd leading the sheep to water that they can drink from. And that's how God takes care of us. There's pleasantness with God's direction. Even in these troubling times, God's direction is pleasant. Many are freaked out. Many are troubled. Many are upset. Yet I pray that there's a calmness in the heart of every disciple, even those who are at high risk. Now, I do think that you should take precautions if you are high risk. Remember that rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous, Matthew 5, verse 45. But you should be at peace because you know where you're going to go when you die. Go to Philippians chapter 1. In verse 21. For to me, to live is Christ, to die is gain. If I'm to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. What shall I choose? I don't know. I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. For a disciple, dying is far better than living because you get to die and go spend eternity with God. All of us should desire this. But if you're alive, Paul recognizes that there is but one purpose, and that is fruitful labor. If you're watching this, you're alive. And that means that you have one purpose, which is fruitful labor, making disciples. And what's really amazing is that it's really never been easier. This format that we have right now, you could literally invite 1,000 people to watch this with a few clicks of a button. And a lot of them will be people that you know. They could be your friends on social media. And they can actually come even if they're not in the New York area. Now, we know that fruitful labor doesn't stop there. It's good to get the message out. But, of course, you have to study the Bible and implement the teachings of the Bible and actually make a disciple. For those who are watching, we would love to set up a time with you to do some personal Bible studies and actually talk about what the Bible means for you practically in your life. I do hope that you fill out the link that's on this page. Or please contact the person who gave you the link to watch this so that we can set up a time and actually talk about how to implement God's word in your life. What's really amazing is that on Friday, Sherry was baptized. That's Tylea's mom. On Saturday, Edie and Keith were baptized. And today, Lord willing, there will be even more baptized after service. Now, here's the thing. We could sit at home and worry about things that are totally outside of our control. Or we could realize that we are here for fruitful labor and we can provide hope. We can realize how many thousands of people are out there that want to be right with God and we have the answer. You can reach them. You know, the coronavirus is not a problem. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for people to be reconciled to God. And I do hope that you view it as such. But God does need your help. God will do the saving, but we are the ones who are called to make disciples. Let's make sure that we are about our purpose of fruitful labor. Let's get back to Psalm chapter 23. In verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you're with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You know, everybody needs refreshment and restoration. As it says at the tail end of verse 3, he restores my soul. For us, we know that this comes in our daily prayers and quiet times. God is guiding us and leading us down paths of righteousness. And sometimes those paths do lead through the valley of the shadow of death. And yet we see at the end of verse 3 that it is all for his name's sake. Everything is about God and not about us. Let's make sure that our focus is to make God's name great. Our point 2 is I will fear no evil. In verse 4, it does say the valley of the shadow of death. Some translations will say the darkest valley. And yet, David recognizes that he's not afraid. He will fear no evil. And the reason is he cites, for you are with me. And of course, he's talking about God. And he says that with rod and staff you comfort me, which is kind of an interesting phrase. The rod is used for discipline. You may recall some of the proverbs that talk about the rod of discipline. And the staff is used for both bringing the sheep back. Of course, it'll have a shepherd's hook that you can literally hook the sheep and bring them back in. But also the staff is used specifically in the Old Testament to denote authority or kingship, like a scepter, that type of thing. And so he's speaking of God as both the one who corrects him, as well as the one who rules over him and pulls him back in. Go to Psalm chapter 56. And it says in verse 3, it says, when I'm afraid, I will trust in you. As I mentioned before, fear is the predominant emotion that I see out there, that I've seen this week. The psalmist says simply in this verse, when I'm afraid, I trust in you. The solution to fear is always trust in God. Because when we walk along with God, we need not be afraid of evil. Whether good or bad outcome, God is with us. God is sovereign. God made it happen or God allowed it to happen. And so we need not be afraid of the results. Go to Jeremiah chapter 17. In verse 7. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. He'll be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. He does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in the year of drought and never fails to bear fruit. Again, the same concept. I'm sure that some of us are feeling the heat. Some of us are feeling the drought. And yet the Bible says that the one who trusts in God has no worries and always bears fruit. Now, if you look at the previous two verses, it talks about the one who trusts in man. In other words, the one who trusts in self. And that's like a person or a bush that's in the wastelands. And the truth is that you have no control when you trust in yourself. You look at our situation right now, the truth is that we are all at the mercy of things that are far beyond our control. And so it's a fool's errand to try to control these things that we have uh, no power over. And yet, when we trust in God, we have no worries and we bear fruit. Um, going back to that key food I went to the other day, I actually just went in there for some ice cream. And when I walked in, I was pretty blown away. I was kind of expecting it to be pretty empty, just like the streets were. But there was a lot of fear in there. And there was a lot of fear of the unknown. And I actually felt a little bit silly holding my ice cream and my seltzer water. But everybody I was looking at was afraid and worried and grabbing stuff. And I was just sitting there just wanting to get some ice cream. I have food, so I knew that I wasn't going to be starving. And the truth is that people can go a long time without eating food. I have toilet paper, and as I was looking at everybody freaking out over toilet paper, I thought to myself, well, there's actually billions of people in the world today that don't use toilet paper. And so I really didn't think anything of it. I know that fear, in a lot of ways, is just a mindset. I choose to believe that God will protect me and my family. And of course, I want to take reasonable precautions as such. But if harm does befall us in this situation, I believe also that God will give us the strength to get through that as well. The key is staying close to God during these times. For many of you, that your schedules will be new. Many will be working remotely or doing different tasks in their jobs. Most will have a lesser commute. It's time to spend a little extra time in prayer and in the Bible. Don't utilize this time to simply sleep in or do more tasks around the home, but use this time to draw close to God, to trust in God, so you can alleviate all of your fears of evil. Fear no evil, because God is with you. Let's turn back to Psalm 23. We'll close out with our final point, verses 5 and 6. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I often pictured this setting a table in the presence of my enemies, and I kind of imagine the enemies lined up there with their swords and everything, and just sitting down at a table eating dinner. And I never quite understood the image that I got from reading this passage. I read some commentaries on it and read some opinions about what he was trying to say here. And through my research, I realized that David, we understand, was a warrior. Now, certainly he was in battle against his enemies often, but there were times when his enemy was Saul, and he was being chased, and he lived in caves, and he hid. And when someone lives in a cave, oftentimes you don't have really great food there. And so you can imagine David hiding out from his enemies in the presence when maybe Saul was close by. And rather than eating whatever he could find in the cave, mushrooms or bats or whatever was in there, instead of eating that, you can imagine him with a nice, big, full feast, enjoying his time there, even with his enemy close by. And I do believe that what he's talking about is the provision that God gave him, even during his most challenging times. After that, he says that you anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Of course, this is just simply blessings and the abundance, even with his enemies around, even in the challenging times. And here's the thing that I find. In life, you will have times of plenty, and you will have times of hardship. And yet God always takes care of you. David's life was very chaotic. You know that he was driven out by his son. You know that he had incredible heartbreak. And yet he says, goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life. You may ask how? Well, it's not by having what you want. It's not by living at peace in all situations. It's about dwelling in the house of the Lord, as the chapter concludes. That's how goodness and love follow you all the days of your life, by dwelling in the house of the Lord. You know, for myself, I'll be celebrating 15 years as a disciple in 2 weeks. And it was really a kind of a cool time this last week because I was invited to church by a man named Paul Reddy, and he invited his cab driver who said, I won't come. And his cab driver gave him my phone number and said, my friend Luke will come to your church. And that's how I got invited. And Paul just kept calling me until I eventually came. I studied the Bible, and it took about 4 months, and I was baptized on April 1st, 2005. Well, Paul began the studies, but after a few studies, there was the leader of the singles ministry at the time named Jay Hernandez, and he's the one who did the bulk of the work over a period of months. And it was really cool because Jay was just in town here in New York, and so I got to spend time with he and his wife and his youngest son for really about a day and a half, which was very special because in the last 15 years, we've not really done much more than share a meal. He went on a planting to a church months after I was baptized, so we've not been part of the same church since I was 2 months old spiritually. And so it was very special to be able to spend that time with Jay. And so I was thinking back on my own conversion, and it was quite unlikely. Aside from the standard wickedness that many people are aware of, drunkenness and impurity and whatnot, I realized that there was a high level of recklessness that was in my life. Drinking high amounts of alcohol and then riding a motorcycle, which I did nearly on a daily basis. And there was a couple of instances where I really couldn't reconcile how I hadn't died. Certainly I had a DUI and my license was taken away, and I had had a couple of motorcycle crashes, but there was one time in particular that my only explanation was that an angel moved me out of the way, because I was coming head on against a Suburban going about 90 miles an hour, and suddenly I wasn't in that lane anymore, and we passed, and I have no explanation for it, but this was before I studied the Bible. So in my mind, at that time, especially when I was studying the Bible, I realized that I should be dead, and I should have been separated from God. This was before I was a Christian, for eternity. And so I was able to think back and reflect on some of these events. As a disciple, there have been many hardships. There have been many challenges. Yet these last 15 years have been the most amazing years of my life. I was married to an incredible and godly woman. I have 4 beautiful children. I've been able to serve in the full-time ministry for the last 11 years. My parents have become disciples, my sister, my daughter, and other friends and families all around me. And here's my one takeaway, is I have never regretted one day in the kingdom. I've never regretted one day that I spent in God's house. Let's close out in Psalm chapter 84. We'll pick it up in verse 10. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. I know that as disciples, we feel many temptations and many challenges. And yet, I believe that David captures in Psalm 23. The sons of Korah capture in Psalm 84 the same concept. That to dwell in God's house is so much better than any other riches, than anything we could have in the world. And one day in the kingdom is better than 1,000 years outside of it. And I pray today that you are filled with these same thoughts and these same sentiments. As we close out, let us remember that the Lord is our shepherd, that we lack nothing. We cannot let any fear of evil befall us because we know that God is with us. And let us dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Thank you, and God bless.